So this is the segue moment where we move from LSU to Alabama because you mentioned quarterbacks either regressing or cementing some bad habits because they have to play sooner than they were planning on. And Alabama fans, after this game, where you would think a 24-7 win over the Washington Huskies would be a great cause for celebration. If you read the boards like Bama Online, you will see a number of Alabama fans contemplating jumping from at least a second story window to break something and take their minds off of the quarterback play that we saw in the Georgia Dome. And Jalen Hurts' line was 7 for 14, 57 yards. That's 4.1 per. No interceptions. But he actually, much to Husky Pup's anger and ultimate scorn, ran the ball more than he threw it. 19 carries. Some of that is probably because he bailed on a pass play. But we got to dig into this, man. I want to talk about this game in general at some point. But right now, I really want to talk about this question of, has Jalen Hurts regressed? And what we saw against Washington, was it more a byproduct of Kiffin not being willing to run the damn ball and protect his quarterback a little bit against a good defense? Or was the stage a little too big for Jalen? Was it him that was the problem? Was it Kiffin that was the problem? Was it a combination of both? Or was it really just an off night that we don't need to read too much into?
I don't think there was any doubt that Hurts was off. I mean, there were a number of sort of easy completions over the middle of the field that he was trying to hit, where he didn't, just didn't have the ball in a catchable position. There were a lot of really open players downfield. I talked to somebody that was at that game earlier today, and his comment was, "Yeah, I mean, you don't see it on. I don't know what it looked like on TV. And on TV, I love big games on ESPN because they feel like they have to give us a close up of whoever the quarterback's face is, and not actually show us anything that's going on in the rest of the football field. But apparently, receivers were generally streaking downfield about every play, and the person was pretty adamant with me that was the case, and. I think Jalen has a tremendous amount of composure with the way he handles himself personally, and he doesn't panic in a physical sense. But I don't buy that he doesn't get rattled. I can just, I maybe have a talent for reading people. That his eyes and the way he acts, he's very aware of the situation he's in. He's aware of the fact that he can't afford to make a mistake, and it's not nerves. It's just more of overthinking. And that comes with being a freshman quarterback and not really, having the experience to know, when to be decisive and when, there's a fine line between decisiveness and risk and recklessness. And a lot of times they seem like the same thing. There was a near pick at the beginning of that game, throwing to the tight end, Howard. And Howard's really pretty open. He's stemming on a corner route, and you see Hurts pat the ball and wait and feel like, okay, he's open, and then he throws it, and he didn't trust himself. He saw that play. He realized Howard was going to be open, but he didn't trust himself to throw it at the break. And because he waited so long, there was a corner that was sitting on coverage on the flat. He read Hurts' eyes and backpedaled and darn near picked that ball off. And it's just, one, it's not really throwing the ball. Hurts can put a lot of velocity on it, but he rarely does in games. Because he's overthinking and he's not just getting a football and throwing it with confidence. And two, there's a lot of patting the ball, not trusting your read, but rather looking to see if the guy's open and throwing it. When you read, you throw it before he's open so it gets there when he is open. We've been fairly critical all year of Alabama's passing game in that regard. We have felt pretty consistently that there were a lot of signs that Jalen Hurts was going to struggle when he played better pass defenses, because when you wait for a guy to be open and then throw it, that works when you have time to do that and when he gets open and stays open. But when you're playing good pass defenses, and particularly teams that play zone, a lot of really good zone coverage, which, by the way, is something Clemson will do quite a bit, then that guy may be open right now, but by the time you release it, he's probably not, and that's not a good thing. And I think a lot of credit though does have to be given to the Washington defense. We talked quite a bit in our preview for this game about the fact that a lot of people were sleeping on how good Washington defense was. I mean, they were an excellent, excellent pass defense. A lot of fast football players that could make breaks in the ball. I was pretty confident that Alabama was going to totally focus on the run as much as humanly possible in this ball game. I didn't really love the play calling and how much they had Hurts drop back to throw, but it's I can understand why he only threw 14 passes. Now, I think they probably called 25 pass plays, which is kind of an amazing thing in and of itself. But they threw 14 passes, and that's because they didn't really want to pass the ball against a team that was just truly exceptional against the pass. Instead, they really wanted to focus on the running game, and as we kind of predicted, was focus on Bo Scarborough.
So I hear you talking a little bit about how Hertz was limited here and maybe did have a little bit of a wide-eyed situation going on. For the Bama fans that are waiting for you to just crush Lane Kiffin, I'm going to give you that opportunity. Was his play calling bad, or was it kind of what he could do against this, as you said, good Washington defense? Or did it look like Kiffin just kind of threw a clunker out there?
I was not a fan of what Kiffin was trying to do, and I'll explain that. Kiffin, here's your paradox. Kiffin called a very good game plan that was not likely to work. If you were in a like on paper talking about what play to call in each situation, a lot of what he was doing was made sense. But one, he created a tendency to pass the ball on first down. He tried to break tendency so often that he created a tendency of breaking tendency. Does that make sense? Everybody expects you to run on first down, so you're going to throw it. Well, if you do that every time, people expect you to be clever, and so
So
what
that's
it
who
was
you are.
math, right? And I mentioned this to you during the game watching it. I did not get why they ran so many naked bootlegs with Hurts. I mean, it must have been 3 times in that game where they ran a naked on first down, and because they were breaking tendency so much, and when they weren't, they were running a zone read. Washington just started bringing corner blitzes from the slot corner. When you run a naked into a blitzing corner, that's not going to go well because that's a fast player that's good in space, and he's going to get to the quarterback the moment he turns around. And they had a few drives. I mean, that play single handedly blew up 2 or 3 drives in that ball game. And that's it's not quite a turnover, but it's close to throwing an interception. Functionally, you lose 15 yards and punt the ball for 50. You've netted 35. You might as well have thrown a 35-yard pass for an interception. It has really the same effect. There were a lot of penalties and whatnot, but I think a lot of it was things like the zone read. We talked extensively this year about the fact that Hertz is a very good runner that is keeping the ball too much. He runs a lot of zone read plays where he sort of trusts himself, I guess, more than the runner. He's nervous to hand the ball off because he's trying to keep. Again, the composure is there, but he's trying to keep control of the situation, and he needs to have more trust in the players around him and hand the ball off and trust your read, trust handing the ball off and make it work. And because he kept the ball, we ended up with Hertz was tied in as the leading rusher in terms of carries with Bo Scarborough. Ran the ball, he had 19 carries. I know that counts sacks. Had more carries than he had passes, but he had only 2.6 yards per carry on those 19. Again, I know sacks are involved, but still not very effective running the ball, especially when you consider that Bo Scarborough had 9.5 yards per carry. And even if you throw out the 68-yard run, he still had over 6 yards per carry. So, all through that game, there were a number of times when Jalen Hurts really needed to hand the ball off on the dive. And we've said all year that in previous games when they were playing significantly worse defenses, Hurts would run for 4 or 5 yards, and keep the game moving. But he was missing a 9-yard carry if he handed the ball off in the dive to the running back. That was the real play there. Well, what happens that 9-yard dive he missed and the 4-yard outside run he got, let's say in his own read where he makes the improper read. When you start playing good defenses, the 9-yard dive he missed becomes a 6-yard dive, and the 4-yard carry becomes a 1.5-yard carry. So if he hands the ball off, they're not going to get a million yards, but the dive will actually keep the drive going, and his missed read does not. And a lot of people, again, they miss that early in the year because they see him moving the sticks, they see him running for 4 or 5 yards a carry, and they assume he's being productive. But what they don't see is, yeah, he's being productive, but he's not being nearly as productive as he should be if he was handing the ball off properly, making the proper zone reads, zone read calls and zone read keys. And Alabama's offense actually was capable of being significantly more effective than they even were, which is kind of scary in its own regard. But at the end of the day, the trick with Alabama is they are so good that they can get away with doing things wrong and still put up a lot of yards and points. But yeah, I definitely think, Kiffin, like with, breaking tendencies, but also continuing to call the zone read when it wasn't being executed very well for whatever reason. And I thought it was interesting on that drive they had, the 98-yard drive. They called zone read a couple times, and then they just handed the ball off for Scarborough when he runs for a first down. Then they do actually break tendency. They throw to Howard down the field. And that 68-yard run, that was the point, right at the point where Kiffin gave up on the zone read and said, you know what, I'm just going to call a direct give to the running back so Hurts has no option to keep it. And what does Scarborough do? There's no real hole. He just bounces as an outside and he runs for 70 yards because at the end of the day, as we very strongly predicted, and I've got to pat myself on the back for this, Washington had a serious issue with the size of Alabama's receivers and tight ends blocking downfield, and there was a major size discrepancy between Alabama's running backs and Alabama's secondary. And the moment Alabama could get to the second level, Washington was outclassed. I mean, Washington either stopped Alabama for 2 yards or they stopped them for 12, but they could not stop them for 6 or 7 because the first guy there in the secondary just had no shot of bringing him down. And, that big play kind of showed with a lot of, very quiet blocks downfield where the receivers are completely eliminating corners and safeties. The one edge that I said I felt like Alabama had in that game was just sheer size on the edges. And it really wasn't until they went with designed runs that they were able to expose it. The zone read should have, in theory, worked better because it takes away an extra guy in the box. But Kiffin kind of refused to accept the fact that sometimes that may be the best play, but if you're not executing it well, you just need to realize we're not going to run this play well. Let's just give it straight to the running back. And even though this maybe doesn't give us quite the same numbers advantage, at least we'll execute it properly, get it to the back, and get it to the edge. And the moment he decided to do that, lo and behold, they score.
I think you pointed out something pretty interesting that really doesn't go noticed enough. Everybody's going to remember the fact that Bo Scarborough is 240 pounds, 230 pounds, and he's bouncing off these smaller DBs and linebackers for Washington. But both sides of the ball are key in this situation because they show the deficiencies for Washington offensively and defensively. So what you touched on, took me forever to get there, was tight ends and wide receivers for Alabama blocking, and they had a lot of success. And honestly, I thought they could do a lot more running to the edges because of that. The DBs for Washington weren't getting off blocks very well. The opposite of that was true for Alabama DBs, which we've seen all year. The one that's most interesting to me to remember is just before the Allen's fumble return for a touchdown, they blew up some plays in the A&M game. They blew up some short screen stuff where the wide receivers are almost like they weren't even there. And Alabama's DBs do a really good job of getting off of blocks from 220-pound 6'2" receivers they did it even better against Washington with their smaller receivers who really couldn't sustain blocks on the edges. And they really, I think, rely on that for Gaskin and Coleman to break free. And I think they saw that pretty early on that wasn't successful for them, which led to between Coleman and Gaskin only having 17 carries combined. So I think it's interesting that you touched on that because not only were Alabama's wide receivers and tight ends getting good blocks, but on the flip side, it wasn't working for Washington either, which really plays into what we were saying last week, where Washington, we knew had a good defense statistically. We knew they'd do some things schematically that would give Jalen Hurts some trouble. But we really felt like over the course of 4 quarters, if they just leaned on them with their physicality, with their size, and athleticism, that over time Alabama would kind of run away with it. So that was interesting to me. The other part of this, though, we're kind of down on Alabama's offense, but Alabama's defense pitched basically a perfect game. They had the one touchdown drive from Washington where they went fast and had some success, but Jake Browning's line in this game, 20 for 38, 150 yards, 3.9 per, with one touchdown and 2 interceptions, one coming at the very end. I don't really count that one. But talk a little bit about Alabama's defense in this game. Was it what you expected in terms of this type of performance? I know you expected the points to be a little higher. And then talk about how, if at all, this defensive performance will translate to a game against Clemson, which with a little bit different athlete and a little bit different offense.
Yeah, I'm not going to say it was exactly what I expected, right? I mean, this was actually pretty dominant. There was that second drive of the game where Washington was able to move the ball a fair amount, and at the risk of pissing off more Washington fans, I'm going to say that drive had more to do with film prep and scheme than it did execution. There was a lot of sort of weird motions and formations, and they were doing really specific things with, they're going to go in this formation, they're going to motion the tight end before the snap outside this receiver, and because they saw in some random play, well, Alabama's going to walk this linebacker to this spot and this safety to this spot. So if we get them in that exact formation, then we can run this specific passing route and we'll have this guy open at this spot. And that only works a couple times because that's a really specific thing you figured out. And you're not going to know how Alabama reacts, only but a couple instances. And so, yeah, you can make that happen. But outside of that one drive, I mean, it was really lopsided. We run our little model, whatever it's worth. It had Alabama 30, Washington 24. We talked a lot about the whole bag of wins concept, the fact that we didn't really buy that the conferences were equal. The model was not going to take into account because there's so little correlation between the conferences in order to sort of get any sort of frame of reference. But, it did have Washington with only 2.2 yards per carry. They ended up with 1.5, part of that sacks that really wasn't, really all that inaccurate. The problem was it had Washington at least getting 7.3 yards per attempt, right? And they only had 3.9. For all the talk about, I heard a lot of talking heads say, Alabama's corners are really just not as good as they have been in years past. That's bull. This is one of the better Alabama secondaries in recent years. I'm not sure this isn't the best Alabama secondary Saban's had, even without Eddie Jackson. I don't know if you agree with me there. But, they had some issues very early in the year, particularly with Ole Miss. Ole Miss at that time was playing an elite level. They were healthy. Their offensive line, more importantly, was very healthy. And Chad Kelly, when he was completely healthy, is I think, probably a first-round quarterback. And he gave them some issues enough that they were still losing, 48-30 at the end of that ball game before they threw a Hail Mary and ended up closing the gap with a score. Hail Mary, onside kick, Hail Mary. For those that don't know, that was a 3-score game right before it ended. But yeah, I mean, it was more lopsided than I expected, but I also don't necessarily think that's going to completely carry over to the Clemson game. Jake Browning is an athletic quarterback by some measure, and he's an accurate passer with a good head on his shoulders, but he isn't a gifted arm talent in a lot of ways. And he's accurate throwing short to intermediate. He knows where to go with the football. We were both very impressed with that early, but he can't make the hero throws, quote unquote. I mean, he made one sort of kind of to score the first touchdown for Washington. That was a great throw to Pettis. But the thing that's gotten Alabama is hero throws, throwing in a tiny window because Alabama runs man coverage with large corners downfield. And when you do that, if you can put the ball exactly where you want it, your receiver is always going to have a little bit of separation, and he's going to have a chance to make a big play down the field. Deshaun Watson should be able to complete some of those passes. I think the problem here is overstating how effective Clemson has been offensively to this point. And I think this maybe is a decent point to sort of transition into the upcoming game. Clemson, they had a great game against Ohio State, no doubt. They won that game by a good margin, put up 31 points, et cetera, et cetera. But it was also, in many ways, kind of an aberration. And I say that because 31 points is a lot of points to score when you're only getting 5.5 yards per play. Clemson had at least 6 yards per play since October 15th, the North Carolina State game. Florida State, Syracuse, Pitt, Wake Forest, South Carolina, Virginia Tech averaged over 6 yards per play in every single one of those contests. And yet, Clemson, didn't score quite as many points, but they were on the same sort of 30-something point level that they were in those. The closest game in a per-play sense to this was the North Carolina State game that they nearly lost. So it's kind of interesting to me that there's such a feeling that Deshaun Watson is an elite quarterback and he's so unstoppable. But the real truth of it is, in a statistical sense, this was actually their worst game passing in over 2 months. It's just, I think unlike, maybe, well, I guess somewhat like the Washington-Alabama game, Washington couldn't move the ball at all, so Alabama would get it back. And the problem was Alabama was completely anemic passing the football, tried to run it, kept digging themselves holes, and that meant that Washington would get the ball back relatively quickly and try to make something happen. Clemson in the same way, the trick here was that Ohio State's offense was completely inept, so Clemson got the ball a lot, and it took them a long time to generate the yardage they ended up getting. So, again, 7.2 yards per attempt is not necessarily that impressive. And, on the season, they're only at 8 yards per attempt. Washington was actually at 9.3 going into the semifinal. So I do think it's blown out a little bit out of proportion in the fact that everybody's going to say, well, Alabama shut down Washington, but can they shut down Clemson? And to sort of finalize that point, Washington had the better passing offense going into the semifinal game. So whenever someone says, well, they can shut down Washington, but can they shut down Clemson? There is a strong implication there that, one, that Clemson in the semifinal is, well, first off, let's throw out the semifinal because I've already established the fact that that really wasn't statistically that good of a game. What's more notable to me is everyone's just sort of assuming that Clemson, year play in and play out, that whatever their statistics were, that because they're in the ACC or because of how they looked, that they were in truth better than Washington. When, again, to put this in comparison, Clemson averaged less yards per attempt in the Ohio State game than they did in their Auburn game in the opener. So I don't know. Although this is long-winded, but I think it's a very important point. Clemson is not going into this game with anything resembling the passing offense I think they really had going into it last year. They're not that far
which
off,
is interesting because
they've
got Mike Williams healthy. So that is kind of interesting.
Yeah, last year too, they weren't really great statistically. The passing offense only had less than 7 yards per attempt in the last two games before the Alabama game. That was the North Carolina game, the Oklahoma game. Still put up a lot of points, but they kind of blew up in the Alabama game. and they've kind of done the same thing this year. At times, they've been very good, over 10 yards per attempt against South Carolina, but they've had just as many, like Wake Forest, where they had 6 yards per attempt, or Auburn and Troy, where they were 7.3, 5.5. Everybody kind of gets enamored when Clemson has a really good game passing the ball, but they just as often have a bad one. And what's even funnier to me, it's easy for me to take that and go, well, they just saw a good game, so they assume that's what they're going to get next time. But what's really, really strange to me about it is, again, Clemson had very similar stats. They were 19 of 34 in the Auburn game for 248 yards. And here they were 24 of 37 for 265 yards. 7.3 yards per attempt against Auburn, 7.2 against Ohio State. Had a better touchdown to interception ratio against Auburn, actually. Yet everyone's just sort of assuming that I don't know. It's really strange. There's no statistically, this was not a great game for Clemson. And the only thing I can really point to was the fact they did at least run the ball for 4.3 yards per carry. They only had 3.4 against Auburn, but it really just was a game where Clemson got the ball a lot, and that let them eventually put up points. But this is not a dominant Clemson offense.
And I'm not saying that Clemson hasn't improved throughout the course of the year, because I think they have, but sort of like we were talking earlier with Southern Cal and LSU and even Auburn, they kind of ran into a just what the doctor ordered situation after they had some struggles. So everybody in their mind thinks, okay, Clemson was kind of fooling around early in the year, and then they really hit their stride. Well, if you look at statistically, the only two top 25 scoring defenses they played this year were Auburn and Troy. So that just happened to coincide with that early part of the year where everybody just assumed they were messing around a little bit. But maybe there's something to this in terms of part of their inflated statistics and numbers offensively, not necessarily from a scoring standpoint, from a 8.5 yards per attempt against Virginia Tech or putting up 37 on Florida State. Maybe it has to do with the fact that defensive opponent wise, their schedule got a little bit easier throughout the rest of the season. Now, we're going to say, okay, well, Ohio State had a top 5 scoring defense. But then if you look at them, they're not playing any good scoring offenses. Michigan could score on, and we've broken this down a little bit in other shows, how when you have an athlete advantage, a 3-yard play turns into a 5-yard play, or 3 yards of separation turns into 5 yards of separation, and that makes all the difference in the world. Ohio State played a bunch of crappy offenses. Now, when you combine that with the fact that Ohio State themselves have a crappy offense, and like you said, you give Clemson the ball a ton of times, that 31 points, kind of like Alabama's 24 points, is really outpacing the actual statistical performance on the field. So, all of that to ask this question: is there something to Auburn and Troy giving Clemson fits because they were good defenses, or is it more that Clemson just took a little while to hit their stride?
I think there's actually something to it, personally. And, well, there's two sides. One, their offensive line did get better late in the year. But at the same time, Clemson's weakness, their real weakness, and the real area where they took a step back, was the losses they took on the offensive line last season. Last year, they could protect the quarterback, give him time to throw, and if he didn't have time to throw, he would sort of scramble. This year, particularly early in the season, when they were playing Auburn, when they were playing Troy, they gave up an incredible amount of pressure in the center of the line. And what that did is it really kind of neutralized Deshaun Watson. If I can get pressure with an interior rusher, that means I can keep my outside pass rushers and just have them contain Watson, and then I'm going to push up the middle. And that means he has nowhere to go. He can't really escape. He can't try to, scramble outside for big yardage because those outside pass rushers are sitting there waiting to pounce, more or less. In previous years, they were good enough in the center of the field that they could, they could pretty much just sort of control the line of scrimmage, um, make things work, and you were going to have to bring a blitz or bring an outside pass rusher to generate pressure. And when you do that, that means you're not sound in coverage, or with the pass rusher, you're more likely to lose containment. It's like you said with the 3 to 5 yard thing. It's a subtle distinction, but the difference in timing there makes a big deal. Clemson didn't really have time to execute their plays properly. Deshaun Watson is a great quarterback, but none of that really matters if he has to throw the ball faster than the route has time to develop. And, like you said, Florida State was a very good team, but Michigan was not a great offense. And Florida State nearly lost to Michigan because Michigan put up over 30 points. Like there's a lot of signs there that Florida State did not have a great defense. So and like you said, even Ohio State really didn't have a great defense. So, Clemson, because they were allowed to operate their offense comfortably and because the other teams have been forced to blitz, I think they yeah, I mean, I think that made all the difference in the world, really, and it let Deshaun Watson be Deshaun Watson, throw guys open, what have you. But yeah, I mean, it. I don't think that you can throw out the Auburn and Troy games early. We talk about this a lot. Teams certainly do develop, but frequently I think people make the mistake of seeing development when there's really just a change in quality of teams. And I think more often than not, when you see a team change in their performance, it's, I think, usually a function of either some sort of matchup or something about the quality of opponents that shifted more than it is a change in the quality of the team itself.
So I'm looking at the NC State game because I think it was Clemson's worst offensive game of the year. I know they only scored 19 points against Auburn to open the season, but statistically they did pretty well, and you've already touched on that a little bit. Mike Williams had a phenomenal game. He was out of his mind. Um, Deshaun Watson against NC State, 17 points in regulation. He threw the ball 52 times, and we've seen this a lot this year where he hits his number in terms of total yards optics, like 278 or 335. That's pretty good. But 52 pass attempts against an NC State team. He had, I think, 34, 35 against Virginia Tech. For Clemson to be successful against Alabama, I know everybody talks about balance, but Gallman's not running the ball like he did last year. I know it's not a whole lot off in terms of yards per carry, but he's just not running the ball. He's 500 yards off total yardage from last season. So, in your mind, can Clemson win this game? And I know we're going to get into the details later, computer model and all that, but just as a scenario to discuss, in your mind, can Clemson win this game if Gallman's running, say, 2.5 yards per carry, CJ Fuller or some backup not getting a lot of yardage, and Watson has to throw it 40 to 50 times? Is there a place in that area that Clemson can still win the game, or does that signify you're in a lot of trouble?
I think they can win the game, honestly, doing that. I don't think it's a good place to be in, but the flip side to this is Clemson's defense is very good, and we'll kind of get into that in a minute. But the issue is Alabama going to put up points themselves? And if you throw the ball 50 times and you have a big play quarterback, you only need to connect on 3. Score 3 touchdowns, and maybe you can win the ball game. Alabama just beat Washington 24-7. That means all Washington really needed to do to win that game was complete 3 more passes. And I know it's saying a lot to complete 3 long touchdown passes, but this gets back to the point earlier. I'm trying to go full circle with this. The problem with Jake Browning, as good as he is he doesn't complete hero throws. He takes what was available to him. Well, Alabama didn't really give him much in true terms of open, easy completions for him to operate the offense. what you almost need is kind of concede play to play that you're not going to have any success, but have a guy that's willing to just chunk it downfield, because all Watson has to do is have a few really accurate throws where he had time to make the pass and have Mike Williams go up and high point the ball in the end zone, generate 14, 17 points like that, maybe 2 touchdowns, maybe 1 long pass, you get a field goal. And if you put 17 points on the board, you're in the ball game. And it, right, I think, yeah, Clemson has had to do some things they were uncomfortable with because, in large part, they haven't been able to run the ball in a dominant fashion. Um, and if they're not getting 3 yards per carry, as long as Alabama is able to doing that not as a result of scheme but just comfortably stopping the run, this is a far 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 better Alabama team at rushing the passer out of base personnel. And that's going to make it a lot more difficult for Clemson to just start throwing the ball over the yard. And as
you're saying far better than the one he saw last year.
Yeah, I think this is sort of a general point. Alabama is probably on the whole better than they were last year, and I would say Clemson is worse. And I think a lot of people saw in truth, Clemson in many ways outplayed Alabama last season and just managed to lose the ball game anyway. I don't really expect a repeat of that because, one, the defenses are very good, and Alabama's defense is even better than the one last year and much better prepared in terms of secondary and pass rush to play a passing team. And two, Clemson's offense has taken a significant step back, and Alabama's offense is a lot more one-dimensional. So, that's kind of what you get. And I'm gonna regress in the conversation and then move back forward. In the Ohio State game that everybody's citing, I've talked a lot about how many plays. Ohio State ran only 56 plays in that ball game for 3.84 yards per play. Against Michigan, Ohio State ran 82 plays for 4.02 yards per play. Point being, Ohio State had similar production, really just slightly worse production than they had in the Michigan game that they won. The problem was they ran almost 30 plays less over the course of the ball game. And conversely, Clemson, Ohio State may have only run 56 plays, but Clemson ran 85 plays in the Ohio State game to put up 31 points, right at 5.53 yards per play. There were only 4 other games this season where Clemson had under 6 yards per play, and they were Auburn, Troy, Georgia Tech, and North Carolina State. So those were not good offensive outings across the board. And I say all this to note that even with that Ohio State game, Clemson has generally struggled when they've played good defenses. It just so happens, as I said, the less than 6 yards per play, 3 of those 4 games were the first 3 games of the year, and then the 4th one was the 6th game of the year. So 4 out of the 6 first games of the year were all the best defenses. And now to progress the conversation and stop regressing and start moving forward with this analysis, when you look at the ACC and their best passing defenses, the best passing defense in the ACC is Clemson. I mean, by a pretty good margin. But in terms of quarterback rating or yards per attempt, we'll go with a yards per attempt figure. The next best pass defense is Miami of Florida, that Clemson did not play this season. Then Virginia Tech, which Clemson beat by 1 touchdown, put up a lot of points, but still beat by 1 touchdown and kind of struggled off and on. There was a lot of punting. Then Louisville, which they narrowly won. Then North Carolina State, that they narrowly won. Then Georgia Tech, that they only put up 26 points. So it pretty consistently this season, when Clemson has been faced with a defense that can really limit the passer, they don't generate a lot of production. And I think there's this preconception, because everybody remembers the national championship game last year, that they're going to come out and just bomb away. There's not much evidence of that. Again, I would say the Ohio State game, it's an aberration. They scored 31 primarily because Ohio State's offense was so terrible at staying on the field. The truth is, you just can't expect a lot of production from Clemson's offense in a per play sense, which means you do kind of go into desperation mode and throw down the field. Which, again, at least Deshaun Watson can do that. He has the arm to throw down the field, and they have the receivers to stretch the field in a way Browning can't. But I don't expect any consistent offensive production from Clemson out of this game.
So we've spent quite a while beating up, but still probably pretty good Clemson offense. You talk about how um, you feel like this Alabama team is better than last year, and this Clemson team is a little bit worse. I wonder, though, because we spend so much time not so much worrying about who's better or worse, but how they match up with one another. I wonder if because of the way Clemson's defense is playing, and not necessarily how they've been playing from a statistical standpoint, but how they match up from a physical standpoint, size, talent, and athleticism, does the fact that Alabama's better and Clemson's worse matter if the matchups aren't in Alabama's favor? And if that's the case, maybe talk about these matchups and where either Alabama has an advantage or a disadvantage relative to this Clemson defense.
Right. I think the first thing that has to be noted, going back to our discussion with the Washington game, was we felt like Alabama had a singular edge with size on the edges and in the secondary. It's easy to say now that we predicted Bo Scarborough would be a like almost singular point that Washington couldn't stop. But, for those that aren't aware, Bo Scarborough only started the Auburn game at the end of the season. He was not even the regular starter for Alabama. So the fact that we pointed that out was actually pretty significant. The problem for Alabama is Clemson is a lot bigger than Washington was. When you look down at, Clemson's depth chart, Cordray Tankersley, 6'1", 200 pounds. That's bigger than the safeties that Washington was fielding. And Clemson's going to run 210, 200-pound safeties. They're a little smaller at the other corner positions, but it's still pretty big. Their linebackers, 230, 235. Bullware. It doesn't sound like much, but that's a 20-pound size advantage they had over Washington's defense. I don't think there is athletic or fast in the back seven. And if anybody gets upset at me, because I probably have been sort of bashing Clemson a lot, I'm not really trying to bash Clemson there. Washington probably is one of the best pass defense. In terms of pure pass defense, Washington may well be the best pass defense in the country. They're third nationally in yard per attempt allowed. But, Clemson, for whatever they give up in speed, they're bigger. And when Alabama decides to run to the edges, that's a huge advantage to be able to crash the play. The problem is they're probably not as sort of quick and disruptive. So it's different. Alabama is going to have to be a lot more balanced than they were against Washington. Alabama could afford and should really, and both of us said intentionally needed to just pound away at Washington running the ball. Washington was so good in their front four at basically being brick walls that you had to run away from them and run on the edges. And it was a very odd, unbalanced offense, which is exactly what we saw. Clemson is a lot more balanced and sound across the board. They're bigger, but not so super disruptive at linebacker and safety. Their linemen are a lot more disruptive than Washington's, but they're not the immovable forces that Washington's defensive tackles were. So Alabama has to be balanced. And, like we said earlier, it's a little bit scary when Alabama can't really complete forward passes with any sort of semblance of consistency. So for that reason, I don't necessarily think Alabama is going to move the ball all that well in this ball game. We guess we can get to the model in a second, but the model kind of bears that out. This, by no shape or form, does this look like it's going to be the high-scoring affair that we saw last season. It wasn't really predicted to be that way last year, but I talk about the roulette concept a lot, right? It hits on black every time, so you wager black. That doesn't work. Past results are no indicator of future success. Don't throw out all the statistics and all the analysis here just because we saw a championship game last year with the same teams. I get that. It still very much looks like a defensive struggle in this ball game.
I think that's a pretty good segue into the model. And for Clemson fans or non-Alabama fans or SEC fans or who listen to this show for the first time, I'd love for you to just one last time this season to maybe touch on a high level on what this model does, but then really, man, let's just get into it because I think the model itself sort of drives some great discussion as well. So just let's dive right into it.
Right. The model and the way it works is as objectively as possible. I want to show what does the average game for each team look like relative to the other. In other words, if I play my B game and you play your B game based off nothing but past results, knowing how you played against the teams you played and how I played against the teams I played and how good those teams are, what does that look like in a yardage and a scoring perspective? And I don't base things off total yardage. I did a long time ago. I've abandoned that because tempo was so screwy. Again, the Ohio State, there's a reason to keep harping on that Ohio State Clemson 56-85 play example, because you may see 40, if you have 40 points off 100 plays, that's not nearly as good as 30 points off 50 plays in a slower paced game. So I look at yards per play. How much offense are you generating in chunks, and every play, how many yards are you really repeatedly getting? And because that's somewhat deceptive, I say how many points do you generate off that? Some teams like Louisville, interestingly this year, like LSU, they need a lot of yards per play to generate points. Some teams, and Alabama and Clemson both fall in this category, can generate a lot of points without a ton of yards per play. That has to do with consistency and power, and it also has to do a little bit with how much garbage time you have. But regardless, that's sort of what the model is. It's saying, this is the expected game based off nothing but past results. I use as objective as possible with statistics. I try not to inject my own idea of what is or is not valuable in terms of pass rush versus turnover, what have you. It's all kind of factored in there at a high level, but not overly strong. Anyway, one of the things I key off of is opponent percentages allowed. So rather than looking at the yards per rush you allow, I look at yards per rush you allow versus the yards per rush that your opponents generally get. And same thing with the passing percentages. This is the statistic where Alabama has been sort of a shocking elite historic level that has made their team so good. Alabama only allows 41% of opponent rush averages. They're currently allowing under 2 yards per carry. And to sort of break it down, anything under 90% is what I would consider. 90% is probably average. 90 to 95, 85 to 90 is good. 80 to 85 is very good. Anything under 80 is what I would consider elite. So 70% to 80% is usually the elite range. To give up 41% of opponent averages is an absurd, almost so low it can't possibly be any better sort of level. And they actually brought that average down against Washington, which is incredible. But Alabama averaging 41, Clemson giving up 81%. That's a very good number. It's not quite elite, so I won't call it it's not a weakness, but it's not an absolute strength. Interestingly, both of these passing defenses almost exactly the same in opponent pass percentage allowed, and that's right at 75%, which is that's elite. These are elite pass defenses on both sides of the ball. Looking at what average, kind of using all that, plugging it in, comparing to the average offensive production, pretty ugly. Alabama should be able to run the ball some, given Clemson's averages and the fact that Alabama has one of the top-rated rush offenses in the country. Alabama should average about 4.7 yards per carry. That's what the model's telling me. But they're only going to average 5.9 yards per attempt, which is pretty miserable. That's about 5.3 yards per play total, 28 points. Basically being able to run the ball enough to generate some drives to score. Clemson, again, the offense isn't what a lot of people kind of seem to think it is statistically. So they're only predicted to get 1.8 yards per carry. That's pretty rough. And only 4.9 yards per attempt, same as Alabama. That comes out to 3.85 yards per play. That's a full yard per play less than Troy allowed. Significantly worse than anything they've had all year. and the model guesses they'll put out about 20 points. Again, um, Alabama 28, Clemson 20. Where does that come from? I use something called a regression curve, so I'm sort of extrapolating that. I'm saying that it's not just a linear thing, right? Every yard per play you get more, you get an extra 20 points. Rather, once you cross below or above a certain threshold, your scoring tends to increase or decrease dramatically. So if you go from 8 yards per play to 10 yards per play, you'll go from 40 points to 70. And likewise, if you go from 5 yards per play to 4, you tend to go from 24 points to 7. Your offense, really, when you go below about 4.5 yards per play, your offense just stops functioning properly. Clemson is predicted to be in the not functioning properly range. Now, Alabama at 5.3 yards per play is not in a great range. You'd like to see that above 5.5 to really be properly executing. But even the 20-point number, it's extrapolating that off a performance that is worse than anything they've seen. And before that seems out of line, let's not remember that Alabama is, by a significant margin, the best defense in the country. So everyone that plays Alabama generally has the worst day they've had all season. The problem I'm saying with all this is that 28-20 score is really basically my model guessing that Clemson does complete some of those hero throws and finds a way to score, because most teams, if they had 3.85 yards per play, they ain't going to score hardly a point in a ball game.
Yeah, and I think not only is this the best defense in the country, it's by far the best defense that Clemson has played this year. I think if you look at the rest of their schedule, yeah, there's an argument for Ohio State, but we've already talked about that, why we don't think. And it's funny, gotta give you a little bit of props. When we did our Auburn, Oklahoma show, you mentioned how you thought Oklahoma might struggle even more with Auburn because Auburn is actually a better defense than even Ohio State in a lot of ways. So I think Auburn would probably be the best defense Clemson has faced this year. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, that's probably fair.
Okay, so Auburn is, by SEC or national standards, I said in our Oklahoma Auburn preview show, I said elite minus for Auburn, whereas Alabama is elite plus plus. And so I think that for all the Alabama fans who are freaking out right now based on what they saw against Washington, and to be fair, there are reasons to freak out, not only for what you saw against Washington, but also Clemson's better than Washington. Clemson is a better team than Washington. I don't think Ohio State's better than Washington, but Clemson is better, so there is reason to worry. And for all you Clemson fans who are like, man, y'all are killing Clemson this whole time, we really, 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 really like your team. We're just trying to discuss this from a perspective of what Alabama fans or SEC fans view on the landscape is and things they may or may not know about your team. So don't think we're killing you too much. If Auburn's the best team they faced, Alabama is even better. There is an opportunity, based on what you're saying, that Clemson scores maybe more points, a few more points, but performs poorer statistically in a per play average, which I think might be the case. But also remember, and this goes back to what you've been harping on with the Ohio State game in particular, if Clemson doesn't get the ball that much, if Alabama isn't going 3 and out literally every time, which they didn't even do that against Washington, as bad as they looked, they were still moving the ball. They were just hitting a brick wall on the 40-yard line, the opponent's 40-yard line. If Alabama isn't going 3 and out constantly, then Clemson's not getting the same number of opportunities, which really reduces their ability to score. And also, if Clemson isn't moving the ball as well, it's given Alabama a few more opportunities with a little bit better field position. We all know Kiffin's going to come out first drive, play action, first down pass, lose a few yards, get a penalty, punt after a 3rd and long. We know that's going to happen, so get that one out of the way. They're probably going to have a little more success offensively than Alabama fans think. So all that to say, I have a gut. Yesterday, knee jerk reaction. I thought Clemson looked a whole lot better than Alabama, but I think that given Alabama's defense having the penchant for making teams look a lot worse than they're comfortable or used to looking, I do think Alabama wins this game, and I do think it's a lot lower scoring than last year. But I think Clemson's defense is good enough to really keep this game super interesting. I'm going 24-21 Alabama. No model, no statistics applied. That's my gut. I think Alabama is a good bit better than Clemson everywhere but quarterback, but that's such a crucial position. And I'm not entirely convinced that Lane Kiffin hasn't checked out a little bit. So 24-21 Alabama. That's my gut. We've talked about your model. Now I'd love for you to talk about your gut.
My gut in this game, I do feel like the model is probably fairly accurate, and then it's a low-scoring game. I think it's going to be painful to watch. We've talked about a lot, right, on the show. Anytime you get below 20 points scored for both teams in a like a projection sense, it starts becoming a coin flip rapidly because one play that a guy catches it, doesn't catch it, the ball bounces one way or another way, ends up deciding the game. So there's the lower, basically the lower scoring it is, the more random chance plays into it. All that said, if I had to guess the way this is going to go, I'm going to guess. I think it's going to, we see a lot of these lower scoring projection games go a little higher. I could see that happening here. I think Alabama's game against Washington was kind of an aberration, right? That was the second lowest scoring game they've had all season, behind only the LSU game. And I felt like they were really out of sync. In large part, and I think this is the interesting sort of thing beyond the stats. Washington had made, that was their Super Bowl, and they'd been preparing for several weeks for Alabama, scouting them. They knew every snap what Alabama was going to run before they ran it. They knew exactly where to crash on every play. Alabama has a pretty simple offense, so if you scout it heavily, I think you can pretty well shut it down. And the same thing I'll say in Ohio State, Clemson. Clemson players were pointing at the Ohio State players more often than not. They're late in the game. There's a play where, Clemson's trying to claw back. It's 24-0. Or Ohio State is trying to claw back, rather. And JT Barrett drops back to pass, and they throw a deep pass down the left hash, and they got a guy open by about 5 yards, and he overthrows it. Well, what's interesting on that play is as soon as Ohio State lines up and they motion out wide, they look to the sideline and then start jumping and pointing. Every DP backs off, the safety rotates over, and that guy that was open actually ends up in double coverage because Clemson knew the exact play that Ohio State was running. That happened all game, and that was due to the fact that there was a tremendous amount of film prep. Outside of scripted drives, which again burned Alabama early against Washington, usually when you have this much time off, it benefits the defense. Offenses in college are not overly in sync, and they're not overly complicated due to limitations in practice time. So if that's the case, and I have a lot of time to watch video, film may not help me, execute throwing the ball, and it may not help me execute running a block, but it sure as heck helps the defense go, okay, they're in this formation, this is the play they're going to run. Neither one of these teams now has 3 weeks to prepare for the game. They only have 1 week this year. So I don't think either defense is at nearly as effective as they were. Again, Alabama, for what you want to say of the Washington game, they only gave up something like 150 yards, really. Clemson, not all that different. So I think this is going to be a little bit more higher scoring just because of that point, despite of everything I've said to this statement. But I still don't think Clemson's offense works in any way consistently. I think they sputter, get a couple of big plays, maybe a couple drives, but for the most part, it's going to be frustrating, disappointing. Alabama puts together a few good drives, much like we've seen a lot of Alabama games all year. They drive the ball consistently better than Clemson, still only put up about 31 points, and Clemson manages to put up 20. So I'm saying really dead on with a model, 31-20 Alabama-Clemson game. And I could see it going higher scoring, but I think the biggest thing here is Clemson isn't going to be anywhere near as effective at disrupting the Alabama offense as Washington was, not because they're worse. In fact, I think the defenses, by the way, pass defense and all, really freaking similar between Washington and Clemson, almost mirror images. Rush defense and pass allowed, it's within about 2% of each other. The problem is Washington had 3 weeks to prepare. Clemson gets one, and for that reason, I think Clemson isn't going to be as effective at disrupting the Alabama offense.
I know it sounds weird, but in my mind, if this game does trend higher in terms of offensive points, I think that really favors Alabama, because that means the one thing that has been so variable and so volatile for them is their offense. And I think the only way you beat Alabama is if you get them like LSU to where they can only score 10 points because their offense is just in complete meltdown mode. Am I crazy to think that? Like if this is getting into the high 20s, low 30s, that actually favors Alabama, because at some point their defense is going to kick in, but it shows that they're able to run the ball and they're able to have some success with the pass.
I totally agree. The most consistent thing in football is running the ball. Teams that don't lose games to bad opponents are teams that run the ball, because if you run the ball well, you're going to generally run the ball well in every game. And if you run the ball well, within a game, you're going to be able to kind of consistently drive the field in almost every situation. It doesn't matter how good you are passing, you're going to have off days, and you're going to have plays that, have sacks and put you in bad down and distance. You're going to have a turnover or two. And so you're going to have inconsistency. So if it gets a high-scoring game, there is no doubt whatsoever Alabama is a dramatically better, especially considering the defenses, Alabama is dramatically better off running the ball than Clemson will be. And if you tell me that this becomes a high-scoring game, I'm going to trust an Alabama team that can run the ball with some consistency way more than I'm going to be able to trust a Clemson team that's going to depend on the pass. Because again, the running back doesn't usually drop the ball running for a 5-yard carry, but your receiver may easily drop the ball on 3rd and 2 on a wide open completion, and that tends to be the deciding factor. So if you've got a pure run team that's dominant and a pure pass team that's dominant, I'm generally going to go with the run team, especially because it's going to wear you out late.
All right, so I've got one more thing I want to talk about before we wrap this one up. It's been another long one. I have this theory, and you tend to like to tell me how my theories are wrong, so I'm going to give you an opportunity to do it this time too. I have this theory about teams that do really well against Alabama, especially quarterbacks and offenses that do really well against Alabama and then just crap their pants the next week or the week before. And it's that a lot of teams who play Alabama, in their mind, they've already lost. It's kind of like that old war adage that you're a really good soldier if you can get in the mindset that you've already died, because you don't care and you do war with a reckless abandon. And I'm not doing a Nick Saban thing where I correlate football to anything close to war, so don't freak out.
Pearl Harbor, girl.
But I feel like a lot of teams, a lot of players, a lot of quarterbacks go up against this Alabama team and they go, you know what? I've already lost. I can't do any worse than everybody else is doing. So they play out of their minds. They're super loose and they're not impacted by the stress and, the reaction to negative plays, because in their mind, that's what's supposed to happen anyway. So they make these ridiculous throws, ridiculous catches, whatever. And I feel like that was the case last year with Clemson against Alabama. They played out of their minds. This is a team that had to hang on to beat a North Carolina team in the game before, or 2 games before in the championship game, that lost to South Carolina. Like, not a good North Carolina team last year, almost beat Clemson. They get in that game with Alabama. They're a year ahead of schedule, and they just play fast and loose and just completely, like, Renfro made some crazy catches, perfect throws, most ridiculous, like, offensive performance you've seen in super tight windows. I feel like this year they're not ahead of schedule. This year is supposed to be kind of their year on schedule. They're losing a lot of players next year. So if they're going to do it, if they're going to win a championship, this year is the time, which could contribute to more stress and them playing a little tighter than they did last year. Is that a thing? Am I being crazy? Or especially with this Alabama team who's so dominant, am I maybe onto something?
I think you are, and I think you're onto something in a couple different levels. First, I spent a lot of hot air, right? And we drug this out forever, but I spent a lot of hot air talking about Clemson's past history. And the reason I did was to sort of note that Clemson statistically isn't sort of dominant enough to expect to put up a billion points in a ball game. And along the same lines, last year, going into the Alabama game, they had 6.47 yards per play. That was above their season average. And the I think the easy thing that a lot of people will draw is to go, well, they did that because that's what you do against Alabama or what have you. But you kind of have to accept the fact that, like, look, do you really think that Alabama last year, their defense was, worse than Appalachian State or Louisville or Notre Dame or Miami, or Florida State or North Carolina or Oklahoma? No, they were a better defense than all those teams. It's just Clemson came in loose. They had a good game plan. I think Alabama probably had a poor game plan, had a bad day, and they managed to put up 40 points. But the point being, last year's result really was kind of an aberration. There was no reason to expect that their yards per play would be above average against an excellent defense. And in the same way, this year, they haven't been statistically as good as they were last year. And further, they were trending up a little more last year. This is why I spent so much time talking about the Ohio State game. They, even against Oklahoma, supposedly had a great defense. They still averaged almost 6 yards per play. They were not as effective offensively against Ohio State statistically as they were against Oklahoma a season ago. Further, the Virginia Tech game, they were pretty similar to where they were against North Carolina. But I just, I think having come out of a dominating win, I think well, first off, what I'm saying here is they're not really peaking. Statistically, they put up 31 points, but it wasn't dominant, so I don't buy that they're peaking. I don't buy that last year's game was anything other than a bit of an exception for a number of different reasons. And so that leads me to the fact that I think last year Clemson went into that game loose. They've been told they were the underdogs. They had no chance. They came out through everything they had. Deshaun Watson was leaving it all on the field, making the hero throws, taking risks. This game, they've just won in a dominant fashion. Everybody believes in them. And for all that's said psychologically, they're going to be a lot tighter. And it's not a regression to the mean. I just, in an average day, you expect an average performance. I don't expect Clemson's offense to explode the way they did last year. And if that seems unfair to anybody, again, it's not. I think Clemson is a very good team the same way Washington was. You just have to at some point step back and accept, this Alabama defense so far this year has been historically good, and notably better against the pass and wide open offenses. And to, my final regression before you force me to completely wrap up, Ohio State had not played anybody that had a wide open spread offense with a good quarterback. They don't have any of those currently. It's not a shot against the Big Ten. They just don't play that style of football at the moment in the Big Ten. Certainly hadn't played anybody with that level of quarterback play. Maybe Baker Mayfield, but it's a very different offense. And I don't think Ohio State was ready for what Clemson did offensively. The linebackers were flat-footed the whole game. The jet sweeps and the zone reads. Ohio State just didn't know how to react. Alabama, on the other hand, has played this style of offense several times this season. Nothing is going to surprise them. They're not going to be caught flat-footed. At least you can't expect it. And, again, defensively, of the four playoff contenders, two of them, Clemson and Alabama, are in the top half of the country in sacks allowed, and two of them, Washington and Ohio State, were in the bottom half. Ohio State was 72nd in the country in sacks allowed. So Clemson, was kind of almost predictably, one of the top three, third in the country in sacks, going against a team that can't defend the passer. Clemson was going to disrupt Ohio State's offense all day. That was the reason that both of us, had said that we felt like Clemson was probably going to win that game. Again, Alabama doesn't have that weakness, so it's just going to be a tough matchup for Clemson, a much tougher matchup, I think, than it was last year. And even though it's a low scoring game, I still can't actually, though I think Clemson can certainly win it, I can't predict that they will win this ball game. Alabama is just flat out the better team.
Yeah, and that's the thing that people get mad about is I don't think we've seen anything this year that would lead someone to predict Clemson to win the game. That doesn't mean they can't win the game, but a lot of Washington fans got mad at us about this. They're like, "Well, we do this on offense and we do this on the defense." And that's fine, and that means that things might happen that lead to you winning the ball game, but given the information, the data, and the history of this season that we have to this point, nothing leads us to a reasonable prediction that you're going to win the game. And that's it's a nuance, but it's important because it shows that we're not bashing your team. We're just being honest to the data, and we're not saying you can't win. But anyone who picks Clemson to win this game is doing a little bit of a gut, is doing a little bit of a riding the momentum from the bowl games kind of thing. And that's okay. That's perfectly reasonable. I just don't think it's as true to the data as maybe what we're doing.
Yeah, and we spent a lot of time today basically to explain 2 points. One, the bowl game shouldn't be taken as some sort of massive momentum swing or indicator of anything other than a good matchup against Ohio State and Clemson being very much what Clemson was the rest of the season. And two, the end of the day, we would pick Clemson to beat anybody else in the country. Probably, maybe Washington would be a close game. I don't know, but we have to be nitpicky when you have Alabama and Clemson in the national title because these are two really, really good teams. And if you have anything that isn't even a weakness, but you have an area that isn't a true strength, the other team is probably good enough to exploit where you are average. So if we are harsh, it is only because anything. If one of these teams is by their conference standards average in any area, for example, Alabama is probably average in the passing game. That means that part of the game is not going to work for them in this ball game, and that's just the way it is.
Yeah, and I think we saw in this Washington game where what's really scary about this Alabama team is they're undefeated. They're a touchdown favorite against Clemson, and they still haven't put it all together this year, which is kind of crazy. They played a horrible game offensively against Washington. They coached a horrible game offensively against Washington, and they executed fundamentals poorly in a way that we haven't seen this bad, I think, under Nick Saban in terms of drop passes, stupid penalties, things that just killed drives. I know we've had some of that, we've seen some of that this year, but saying all that, as big as a mess as Alabama was, they won 24-7.
Right. You have to have massive advantages or you're not going to win because Alabama is so incredibly, ridiculously talented across the board that if you do anything wrong anywhere, that will cause you to lose the ball game.
All right. So do you have anything else in this game? I think we've covered basically everything we set out to talk about.
No, I can't really think of anything else.
All right. Well, everybody, this is probably not – I don't think this is our last show for this football season. We'll probably review the national championship game and maybe slide in a little bit of discussion about Auburn and Oklahoma, which is yet to play. But just, again, want to thank everybody like I do at the end of every game. Thank Husky for hanging with me all year. Husky Pub obviously bringing all the knowledge and analysis that anybody could ever ask for. The response from everybody, both from the podcast side and the YouTube side, has been tremendous. We're really committed to doing this next year. We want to make it even better. So any feedback, you can hit us up on scfans.com. There's a contact page. You can give us some feedback there. also, I guess like we do every week in this game, in the comments, if you want, give us a score prediction. Clemson fans, feel free to jump in there too. I know y'all are probably a little salty about what we've had to say in this one, but anyway, thanks so much, everybody. Have a great week. Have a blessed 2017. God bless everybody. Thanks.